So if they were normally at a slight distance or living down the road or just, whether it be 15 minutes or 1,500 miles.
One sentence. That is all it took for Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, to stop Britain completely in its tracks. Her sudden explosive remarks about Meghan Markle have just gone viral, sending Buckingham Palace into a frantic damage control scramble and leaving Meghan's team in California in a state of absolute panic. Sophie is normally the royal family's quietest weapon. Until now. What did she finally say? Why choose this exact moment to break her silence? This documentary uncovers the devastating words that just shattered the monarchy's most fractured relationship. The remarks that started everything. There are moments in public life when someone says something that cannot be unsaid. Not because it is shocking in an obvious way, not because it contains a direct accusation or a dramatic revelation, but because it is so precisely aimed, so carefully worded, and delivered by exactly the right person at exactly the right time, that everyone who hears it understands immediately what it means. Britain had one of those moments in the spring of 2026, and the person who created it was not a tabloid editor, not a political commentator, not a royal biographer with a book to sell. It was Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. To understand why the remarks landed the way they did, you first have to understand the environment in which they were made. Sophie was attending a charity luncheon in central London in late March 2026, an event connected to a foundation she has supported for several years, focused on women's health and community resilience. The event was not televised, it was not streamed, there was no red carpet, no formal press presence, no expectation that anything said inside that room would travel beyond it. It was, by every measure, a private gathering of supporters and patrons in a modest venue in the city. But someone in that room had a phone, and what Sophie said during her informal remarks to the assembled guests was recorded, clipped, and posted to social media within hours of the luncheon ending. By the following morning, it had been viewed millions of times. By the afternoon, every major British news outlet had covered it. By the evening, it had crossed the Atlantic and was leading entertainment and royal news cycles in the United States. So, what exactly did Sophie say? Speaking about the importance of women supporting other women in public life, she made a comment that was, on its surface, a general observation about authenticity. She said that the women she admired most were those who understood the difference between performing a cause and actually living one. She said that in her experience, the most damaging thing a person could do to a genuine movement was to attach themselves to it visibly and loudly while contributing nothing of substance behind the scenes. And then, with a calm that those present described as completely deliberate, she added that she had watched this pattern play out from a very close distance, and that it had caused real harm to real people. She did not name Meghan Markle. She did not need to. The timing, the context, and the specific language she used made the reference unmistakable to anyone who had been paying even minimal attention to the royal family over the preceding 3 years. The phrase performing a cause rather than living, one landed directly on the central criticism that has followed Meghan's public advocacy work since she and Harry left royal duties in 2020. The reference to watching this pattern from a very close distance removed any remaining ambiguity about who she was describing. The reaction in Britain was immediate and overwhelming. Social media divided sharply along lines that have become familiar in conversations about Meghan. One side saw Sophie's remarks as a long overdue statement of truth from someone uniquely positioned to speak it. The other side saw them as a coordinated palace attack on a woman who had already left the institution and built a new life elsewhere. Both sides agreed on one thing. This was not an accident. Sophie does not make accidents of this kind. What made the moment so significant was not just the content of what she said, but the identity of the person saying it. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, is not a royal who speaks carelessly. She learned that lesson early, and she learned it at considerable personal cost. In 2001, she was caught in a tabloid sting operation, where recordings of her making candid comments about political figures were published, creating a crisis that threatened both her marriage and her place in the royal family. The experience transformed her. She became, over the 2 decades that followed, one of the most disciplined and diplomatically careful members of the entire institution. She says what she means, and she means what she says, but she almost never says anything that could be used against her or against the crown. Which is precisely why what she said at that luncheon in March 2026 hit Britain so hard. This was not a slip. This was not a moment of unguarded frustration catching up with someone who had been too careful for too long. Those who know Sophie well were almost universally consistent in their assessment when the recordings emerged. She knew exactly what she was saying. She knew exactly how it would land, and she said it anyway. The question that Britain could not stop asking in the days that followed was simple. Why now? What had happened? What had changed? What had finally pushed one of the most controlled communicators in the royal family to make a statement this pointed, this public, and this impossible to walk back? The answer to that question requires understanding not just the remarks themselves, but the woman who made them, the history she carries, and the specific pressures that had been building inside the royal family in the months leading up to that luncheon in central London. Because what Sophie said in that room was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment a much longer and much more complicated story finally became impossible to keep quiet. Stay with us, because what comes next reframes everything. The woman behind the words. To understand why Sophie's remarks carried the weight they did, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the polished, assured Duchess of Edinburgh, who commands a room with quiet authority today, but to the young woman who arrived on the edges of the royal family in the mid-1990s with very little preparation for what the life actually demanded. Sophie Rhys-Jones, as she was then, met Prince Edward in 1993. She was working in public relations, confident and socially capable, but entirely without the institutional framework that royal life requires. Their relationship developed quietly over several years before their engagement was announced in January 1999. The wedding that June was a moment of genuine public warmth. Britain liked Sophie. She seemed real in a way that royal partners did not always manage to seem. She smiled without calculation. She spoke without a script. She appeared in those early years to be exactly what she presented herself as. And then came 2001, and everything changed. A journalist working for the News of the World approached Sophie posing as a potential client for her public relations firm. Over a series of recorded conversations, Sophie made candid and politically charged comments about members of the government, about the royal family, and about public figures she dealt with professionally. When those recordings were published, the fallout was swift and serious. The palace was furious. Edward was devastated. Sophie issued a public apology and stepped back from her professional career almost entirely. What followed that crisis is the part of Sophie's story that most people forget or never fully knew. Because rather than retreating into irrelevance, which is what happens to many royal partners after a public stumble, Sophie did something far more difficult. She rebuilt herself from the inside out. She gave up the career that had defined her identity before Edward. She redirected her energy entirely toward royal duty, toward charity work, toward the kind of patient and unglamorous public service that generates very little media attention, but builds something far more durable than celebrity. Over the following 2 decades, she accumulated a record of genuine commitment to causes that most senior royals avoid because they are difficult, underfunded, and offer limited opportunities for flattering coverage. She focused heavily on preventing sexual violence in conflict zones, traveling to some of the most dangerous and underreported regions in the world to meet survivors directly. She did not send a spokesperson. She did not issue statements from a comfortable distance. She went herself, repeatedly, quietly, without cameras that she had invited. The contrast with how Meghan Markle has approached public advocacy is one that people inside the palace have been privately drawing for years. It was never stated publicly. It was never briefed to journalists. It existed as a quiet and unspoken comparison in the conversations of those who watched both women operate from close proximity. Sophie represents one model of royal public life: deep, sustained, personally costly commitment to work that rarely generates headlines. Meghan represented, at least in the view of those inside the institution, something closer to the opposite: high-profile attachment to causes that generated maximum visibility, with limited evidence of the kind of sustained personal investment that Sophie's work demanded. That comparison matters because it explains the specific language Sophie chose at the luncheon in March 2026. The phrase "performing a cause rather than living one" was not abstract. It was drawn from direct personal experience. Sophie has spent 20 years living her causes in conditions that nobody photographed and nobody applauded. She has sat with women in the Democratic Republic of Congo who had survived atrocities that most people in her social world could not begin to imagine. She has done that work without a Netflix deal, without a podcast, without a lifestyle brand attached to her name. When she describes watching someone perform a cause from a close distance and seeing it cause real harm to real people, she is drawing on something specific, and those who know her understand exactly what that something is. The harm she referenced is worth examining carefully because it points to a dimension of this story that has received very little serious attention. Sources close to the royal family have consistently described the period between 2019 and 2022 as one of the most damaging in the institution's recent history, not primarily because of what Harry and Meghan said publicly after their departure, but because of what their departure itself did to the working relationships and personal bonds inside the family. People who had spent years building collaborative charitable structures found those structures suddenly politicized. Causes that senior royals had worked on together became associated with one side or the other of a public narrative that nobody inside the palace had asked for or wanted. Sophie watched that happen from the center of it. She is married to Edward, who is among the quietest and most privately oriented of the senior royals. She has never sought conflict, never courted controversy, and never positioned herself as anyone's ally in any palace power struggle. But she was present for all of it. She saw what the departure cost the people who remained. She saw the charitable work disrupted, the institutional relationships strained, and the public's understanding of the royal family's genuine contributions distorted by a narrative that she believed was fundamentally dishonest. And she stayed quiet about it for years. That is the part that matters most when you try to understand why March 2026 was the moment she finally spoke. Sophie does not have a history of impulsive decisions. The 2001 crisis cured her of those permanently. Every significant choice she has made in the 25 years since has been considered, measured, and made with a clear understanding of the consequences. When she stood up at that luncheon in central London and said what she said, she had already made peace with the fact that it would travel far beyond that room. She had already decided that the cost of continued silence was higher than the cost of speaking. What pushed her to that conclusion in early 2026 specifically is connected to events that were unfolding simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic. On one side, a royal family navigating the ongoing fallout of Prince Andrew's arrest, and the public pressure for institutional accountability that followed it. On the other side, Meghan Markle in California, expanding her public profile through a series of initiatives that those inside the palace viewed with a combination of exhaustion and genuine anger. The specific initiative that sources identify as the final trigger for Sophie's remarks was a series of public statements Meghan made in February 2026, connecting her own experiences inside the royal family to broader conversations about institutional racism and the treatment of women in positions of public power. The statements were carefully worded and widely covered. They were also, in the view of people who had been present for the events Meghan was describing, a selective and, in some cases, flatly inaccurate account of what had actually happened. Sophie heard those statements. She considered them for several weeks. And then she went to a charity luncheon in central London and said what she said. The woman behind those words is not someone acting out of spite or personal rivalry. She is someone who spent 25 years learning the difference between saying something because it feels good and saying something because it needs to be said. She reached a conclusion, and she acted on it with the same quiet deliberateness that has defined everything she has done since 2001. The question that remained after Britain absorbed the shock of her remarks was what those words had landed on in California. Because Meghan's world in the weeks surrounding Sophie's comments was already under considerable pressure, and the viral spread of those remarks hit a situation that was far more fragile than the polished exterior of her public brand suggested. Meghan's world, when the remarks hit picture. The scene in Montecito, California in the final days of March 2026. A carefully constructed public relations operation, built over several years, designed to position Meghan Markle as one of the most influential and credible voices in the global conversation about women's empowerment, institutional reform, and progressive values. A lifestyle brand that had been gaining commercial traction. A podcast that had returned after an earlier cancellation with renewed energy and a refreshed format. A social media presence that had been rebuilt with deliberate care after years of managed absence. From the outside, Everything looked controlled, purposeful, and ascending. From the inside, according to sources familiar with the operation, the picture was considerably more complicated. The months leading into March 2026 had been difficult for Meghan's team in ways that had not yet fully surfaced publicly. The lifestyle brand, American Riviera Orchard, had experienced a slower commercial rollout than the initial launch suggested. Several product lines that had been announced with significant fanfare had not reached the market on the timelines originally communicated. Retail partnerships that sources indicate were in advanced discussion had stalled. The gap between the public presentation of momentum and the private reality of where things actually stood was, by multiple accounts, widening. The podcast had performed better. Its return generated genuine attention, and the early episodes drew strong numbers. But sustaining that attention required a consistent supply of content that was both personally revealing and strategically safe, a combination that is harder to maintain than it sounds. Meghan's team had been navigating the tension between those two demands for months, trying to keep the audience engaged without creating new material that could be used against her in the ongoing public narrative about her relationship with the royal family. And then, Sophie's remarks went viral, and everything that had been difficult became significantly harder overnight. The first response from Meghan's inner circle, according to sources, was not panic in the dramatic sense of the word. It was something more controlled, but equally revealing. It was the specific kind of high alert that a well-drilled communications team enters when something happens that was not in any version of their planning. Phones were active from early morning. A crisis assessment was conducted within hours of the story breaking in Britain. The core question being asked inside that operation was not what Sophie had said. Everyone knew what Sophie had said. The question was how much of the British public believed it, and how quickly the story would establish itself in the American media cycle in a form that could damage the brand Meghan had spent years constructing on this side of the Atlantic. The answer to that question arrived faster than her team had hoped. By the afternoon of the day the story broke in Britain, American entertainment and culture outlets had picked it up. By the following morning, the framing that was taking hold was not the one Meghan's team would have chosen. The dominant narrative was not a story about royal politics or palace power struggles. It was a story about authenticity, about whether Meghan's advocacy was genuine, about whether the woman who had positioned herself as a champion of honesty and transparency was being called out by someone with direct personal knowledge of how she actually operated. That framing was damaging in a specific and targeted way. Because authenticity is not just one element of Meghan's public brand, it is the foundation of the entire structure. Everything she has built since leaving royal duties, the interviews, the documentary, the podcast, the advocacy work, the lifestyle brand, all of it rests on a central proposition: that she is someone who chose truth over comfort, who walked away from an institution that required her to be silent, and who now speaks and lives with a freedom and honesty that her time inside the palace denied her. Sophie's remarks and the way they were received by the British public directly attacked that foundation. The specific phrase that caused the most damage in media coverage was the one about performing a cause rather than living one. It was quoted repeatedly. It was used as a headline. It became the shorthand through which the entire story was discussed. And because it was so precise, because it so specifically targeted the gap between public performance and private substance, it was almost impossible for Meghan's team to counter without engaging with it directly. And engaging with it directly meant amplifying it further. So, they made a decision not to respond, at least not immediately and not officially. Sources indicate that several draft responses were prepared and reviewed in the days following the story breaking. None of them were released. The calculation, according to people familiar with the thinking, was that any direct response would extend the story's life and give it a second wave of coverage built around Meghan's reaction rather than Sophie's original remarks. Silence, they concluded, was the safer strategy. But silence created its own problem, because in the absence of any response from Meghan's team, the space was filled by commentary. Royal experts, cultural commentators, former palace staff, and a steady stream of British voices who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening all weighed in. And the overwhelming direction of that commentary was not sympathetic to Meghan. Britain, which had watched Sophie's remarks with a kind of quiet satisfaction that cut across usual royal family opinion lines, was not in a mood to be generous. The impact on Meghan personally, as distinct from the impact on her brand, is harder to document but important to understand. Sources who have spoken to people close to her describe someone who was genuinely affected by Sophie's words in a way that went beyond professional concern. The reason for that is specific. Sophie is not one of the royals that Meghan has publicly positioned as an adversary. The narrative that Meghan has built about her time inside the family centers primarily on experiences with other figures. Sophie has largely remained outside that narrative, neither defended nor attacked, present in the background of the story without ever becoming a central character in it, which means that Sophie's decision to speak publicly and to speak with such precision carried a particular kind of sting. It was not the expected attack from an expected direction. It came from someone Meghan had essentially left alone, someone who had no obvious personal motive for conflict, someone whose reputation for integrity and genuine public service made her words considerably harder to dismiss than criticism from sources whose own credibility could be questioned. Harry's response to the situation added another layer of complexity. Sources describe him as deeply uncomfortable with the attention the story generated, though for reasons that were not entirely aligned with Meghan's concerns. Harry has been navigating his own complicated relationship with the institution he left and with the family members who remain inside it. Sophie and Edward have maintained a quieter distance from the Sussex situation than some other family members. For Harry, Sophie's public remarks represented a closing of a door he had perhaps not admitted to himself. He was still hoping might remain open. The communication between Harry and Meghan during the days the story was at its peak is described by sources as tense, not in a way that suggested any fundamental rupture, but in the way that pressure reveals the specific fault lines that exist in any relationship. They were navigating the same crisis from slightly different positions and with slightly different priorities. Meghan was focused on the brand and the American audience. Harry was processing something more personal. Managing both sets of concerns simultaneously without a resolution available to either of them was not easy. By the end of the first week after Sophie's remarks went viral, Meghan's team had settled into a strategy of deliberate redirection. New content was pushed across her social media channels. A podcast episode that had been scheduled for later in the month was moved forward. A series of photographs documenting her involvement with a California-based community initiative were released. The goal was to shift the conversation, to generate new material that journalists and content creators could engage with rather than continuing to amplify Sophie's words. The strategy worked to a limited degree. The immediate intensity of the coverage began to subside after 10 days or so. But the underlying damage, the question that Sophie's remarks had planted in the minds of people who had previously given Meghan the benefit of the doubt about her advocacy work, did not disappear with the news cycle. It settled into the longer conversation about who Meghan Markle actually is beneath the carefully constructed public presentation. And that conversation, once genuinely opened, is not easily closed. What the panic inside Meghan's operation ultimately revealed was something that the polished surface of her public brand had been working hard to conceal. The foundation is less stable than it appears. The commercial operation is less advanced than the announcement suggested. The American audience that Meghan has been cultivating is more susceptible to questions about authenticity than her team had accounted for. And the distance between California and London, which had previously felt like a form of protection, insulating Meghan from the daily pressures of royal life and British public opinion, turned out to offer far less protection than anyone had assumed when a credible voice inside that world decided to speak plainly. Sophie had spoken, Britain had listened, and in Montecito, the consequences of both those facts were still being absorbed when an even larger question began to emerge. What did Sophie's remarks signal about the direction the royal family was moving? And what did that mean for any remaining possibility of the reconciliation that Harry, at least, was still quietly hoping for? That question takes us to the final and perhaps most consequential part of this story. What this moment reveals about the royal family and what comes next. Pull back from the immediate noise of the story, and something larger comes into focus. Sophie's remarks were not an isolated moment of personal frustration, finding its way into a public setting. They were a signal. And signals from inside the royal family, when they come from someone with Sophie's discipline and track record, are rarely accidental and never without consequence. To understand what this signal means, you have to look at the broader landscape of the institution in the spring of 2026 and ask a question that most royal coverage avoids. What does the palace actually want the public to understand about where things stand with Harry and Meghan right now? The answer that Sophie's remarks suggest is uncomfortable but important. The palace wants the public to understand that the period of careful neutrality is over. For several years following Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties in 2020, the institution maintained a studied and deliberate silence on almost everything connected to the couple. Individual family members did not comment. Official spokespeople deflected questions. The strategy was one of managed distance, neither endorsing nor attacking, allowing the couple to build their post-royal life in America while the family got on with the business of the monarchy without them. That strategy had costs. It meant absorbing a series of public attacks, the Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, Harry's memoir, without mounting any visible defense. But the calculation was that engaging would only amplify the damage. Something has shifted. And Sophie's remarks are the clearest public evidence yet that the calculation inside the palace has changed. The shift did not happen overnight. It has been building through a series of developments over the preceding 12 months that individually appeared unconnected but collectively point in a single direction. William's increasingly visible authority inside the institution. Charles's declining health and the accelerated transfer of real decision-making power to the next generation. The Andrew crisis and the intense public pressure for the monarchy to demonstrate genuine accountability and reform. All of these developments have created an environment inside the palace where the old strategy of managed silence no longer serves the institution's interests. William, who is now the dominant force shaping how the monarchy presents itself to the public, has a fundamentally different view of how to handle the Sussex situation than the approach that characterized the earlier years of his father's reign. Sources close to his thinking describe someone who has run out of patience with a posture that he believes has allowed a damaging and dishonest narrative about the royal family to go unchallenged for too long. He is not interested in public feuds. He is not interested in tabloid warfare, but he is interested in truth, and he has, according to those who know him well, been quietly encouraging those around him to stop treating silence as the only available response. Sophie heard that encouragement, and she acted on it in the way that is most consistent with her own character and her own values. Not with a dramatic interview or a carefully placed briefing to a sympathetic journalist. With a few precise sentences in a room she knew was not entirely private, delivered in a tone so calm and so measured that nobody could accuse her of losing control. It was, in its way, a masterclass in the kind of communication that 25 years inside the royal family teaches you if you pay attention. The specific timing of her remarks in relation to Meghan's February 2026 statements about institutional racism and the treatment of women deserves careful examination, because the sequence matters. Meghan spoke in February. Sophie responded in March. That is not a coincidence. The sources indicate that Meghan's February statements were received inside the palace with a level of anger that surprised even those who thought they had already absorbed the worst of the Sussex situation. The specific claims made and the way they were framed to connect Meghan's personal experience to broader social and political conversations were viewed internally as a deliberate escalation designed to generate American media attention at a moment when the palace was already managing multiple crises. The feeling inside the institution, according to sources, was that a line had been crossed. Not for the first time, but in a way that felt qualitatively different from previous provocations. And the response, when it came in Sophie's voice. What does this mean for any remaining possibility of reconciliation between Harry and the family he left? That question sits at the heart of everything that follows from this moment. And the honest answer, based on everything that sources are describing about the current state of relationships inside the palace, is that the window is not closed, but it is considerably narrower than it was a year ago. Harry's situation is genuinely complex and genuinely sad in ways that the public narrative rarely captures accurately. He is a man who made a series of decisions that he believed at the time were necessary for his own survival and his family's well-being. Some of those decisions he almost certainly still stands behind. Others, according to people who have spoken with those close to him, he views with considerably more ambivalence than he has publicly acknowledged. The memoir in particular is described by sources as something Harry has struggled with privately. The specific details it contained about family members, the conversations it exposed, the portraits it painted of people he grew up with, and in some cases still loves, sit uneasily with him in ways that the public reception of the book did not fully allow him to process. His relationship with William is the one that matters most and the one that is most broken. They have not had a genuine private conversation, according to sources, since the period surrounding the late Queen's death in 2022. The interactions they have had since then have been formal, brief, and managed through intermediaries. There is no active hatred between them. Sources are consistent on this point. But there is something in some ways harder to repair than hatred. There is a settled distance, a mutual recognition that the trust which once existed between them is gone, and that rebuilding it would require a level of honesty and vulnerability from both sides that neither is currently in a position to offer. Sophie's remarks and the way they were received make that distance wider, because they represent the family speaking with one voice, not through William, whose complicated feelings about Harry are well documented, but through Sophie, whose reputation for fairness and genuine integrity means her assessment carries a weight that William's never quite could on this specific subject. For Meghan, the implications are different, and in some respects more immediately significant. The question that Sophie's remarks raised about the authenticity of her advocacy work is one that has a direct bearing on the commercial and professional future she has been building in California. That future depends on partnerships, on investment, on the willingness of brands and platforms and audiences to engage with her as a credible voice on the subjects she has chosen to champion. Credibility, once genuinely questioned by a source that cannot easily be dismissed, does not recover on its own. It requires sustained demonstration of exactly the substance that Sophie suggested was missing. The challenge Meghan faces is that the most obvious way to demonstrate that substance, deep and unglamorous commitment to causes that generate limited personal visibility, is almost entirely incompatible with the public brand architecture she has spent years constructing. Her brand requires visibility. It requires the high-profile attachment to causes that Sophie specifically identified as the problem. Changing that architecture fundamentally would mean rebuilding almost everything from the ground up. Maintaining it means continuing to be vulnerable to exactly the criticism Sophie articulated. There is no clean resolution available to her, and that is perhaps the most significant consequence of what happened in that London luncheon room in March 2026. Look at the full picture of what this moment represents for the royal family itself, and something genuinely important emerges. The institution is in the middle of a generational transition that is reshaping not just who holds power, but how that power is exercised and communicated. William's monarchy, when it arrives, will be defined by a set of values that are in direct and deliberate contrast to some of the patterns that characterized his father's generation. Accountability over opacity, substance over performance, earned authority over assumed privilege. Those values are ones that Sophie has embodied for 25 years. Her willingness to speak plainly about performing a cause rather than living one is not just a comment about Meghan. It is a statement of principle about what the institution now considers important. And it signals, more clearly than any official communication could, that the people shaping the monarchy's future have decided that some things are worth saying even when saying them is complicated. Charles is still king. The formal structures of the institution remain intact, but the moral center of gravity has shifted. It sits now with William and with the people around him who share his vision for what the monarchy should be. Sophie is one of those people. Edward, quietly and consistently, is another. The generation that is inheriting this institution is not a generation that intends to manage its problems through silence and manage distance. It is a generation that has decided, with the specific patience of people who have waited a very long time to be in a position to decide anything, that honesty is not a liability. What happens next in the Sussex story is genuinely uncertain. Harry's situation will continue to evolve, as his father's health does. The question of whether he returns to Britain for any formal occasion connected to the monarchy remains open and is discussed with anxiety on both sides. Meghan's professional trajectory will depend on how effectively her team can manage the damage that Sophie's remarks have introduced into her credibility narrative. But one thing is no longer uncertain. The palace has found its voice on this subject. It found it in a room in central London, delivered in the measured tones of a woman who spent 25 years learning exactly when to speak and exactly what to say. Sophie said what needed to be said. Britain heard it, And the conversation that follows from that moment will shape the relationship between the Sussexes and the crown for years to come. The only question left is whether anyone in Montecito is truly listening. Sophie said what the palace had been thinking for years. She said it calmly, precisely, and without apology. The royal family is no longer managing this story quietly. It is shaping it deliberately. If this documentary gave you a clearer picture of what is really happening, subscribe, hit like, and stay close because this conversation is far from finished.